Good day to everyone. I'll resist the temptation of saying good morning because it's most likely evening where most folks are. So I'll keep it at saying good day. Just to add on to what Carl has said, my name is Tawanda Hove. I'm a senior program officer within the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My focus is on digital agronomy and extension and advisory services. So I feel very honored and privileged to be making this keynote today. So essentially, what I want to be talking about is the future of extension and rural advisory services, with a very strong focus on artificial intelligence, digitization, and I will touch on the reasons why, within the foundation at least, we believe that within the next 10 years, this is the kind of evolution we should expect in terms of rural advisory services in extension, which is agriculturally focused. So, if I want to summarize my presentation today, I'll summarize it by essentially speaking about three key pieces, although I will major on one. So, the first piece is on product service delivery. Um, I think a lot of us will agree that there's been generally a decline of, smallholder farmers, in particular's access, to extension and advisory services in the traditional way. And this is primarily driven by, two factors. Number one, it is the budgets. The budgets, especially for the Global South, most of extension and rural advisories have been, driven by the public system. But a lot of these emerging countries' economies are in a recession or are struggling. And when it comes towards the prioritization or allocation of resources, extension and advisory services from an agricultural perspective usually suffers. I was in Nigeria earlier on in the year, and I grew up predominantly in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe in particular, and I used to think an extension ratio of one, extension worker to about, 1,500 to 2,000 was bad. But when I went to Nigeria, I realized it could even go as high as up to 12,000 or 15,000, which shows that despite you might have, a public, advisor deployed within a geography, the ability to extend or the ability to deliver service is significantly compromised. So because of that, there's an evolution now in terms of the actual product or the actual service design in terms of how do you then get, advisories to smallholder farmers. So this evolution, which we foresee within the next 10 years, would be highly digitized. I know currently there are issues surrounding digital penetration, access to devices, connectivity. But I think when you look at, geographies like Sub-Saharan Africa, there's been, a leapfrogging of sorts, if I may say, in the sense that I think not too many people anticipated digital penetration to grow as rapidly as it has happened within, Sub-Saharan Africa. I just came back from Zambia, and, when you go to the rural areas, you find, 70, 80-year-olds now having some form of a mobile device and interacting with it for various reasons. You find huge penetration of, digital financial transactions happening. So the world essentially is going digital. And I think it's quite encouraging to see that the rural communities we care about are also not being left out or are trekking along. So I think that is the first key piece in terms of product service delivery. And I'll provide much more data in terms of why we believe this is a core piece. Then the second aspect related to what I had indicated earlier on is on business models. I think the days are quickly getting numbered for extension and advisory services just to be anchored on public funding. We see there's now growth of the private sector in terms of providing advisory services. And also, in addition, there is now, an emerging, theme of public-private partnerships whereby the government does still retain the mandate of ensuring that as many and the greater parts of the population do receive extension advisory services. But we see a coming together of, the public sector and the private sector having a tag team in terms of the delivery of these services and having cost recovery models that actually make sure that these services are sustained. I think if you look at, India, which is some of the examples we'll dive into, you have a situation whereby private sector companies are now delivering the extension, but in terms of some of the funding is coming from the government, some of the funding is coming from input companies, the other funding is coming from off-takers. So uh, I think there is consensus within the agricultural system that in as much as incentives might differ amongst agricultural players, there is a way of coming up with business models that then enable delivery of extension and advisory service to empower, capacitate farmers, which benefits multiple players within the ecosystem. Just to share an example of some of these incentives, if you look at the government, one of the core mandates government would have is on food security and nutrition. So you'd find that government would have a stake from that perspective. But if you look at input suppliers, the underlying incentive, if you have more knowledgeable or better advised farmers, then you then have improved productivity, which then creates improved demand. On the flip side, if you look at the off-takers, if you have well-informed and advised farmers who can make quality solid decisions within their agricultural enterprises, you then get supply chain security, improved quality in terms of the produce produced by the farmers. So we see this in a lot of value chains. Take, for example, coffee and tea. Supply chain security has been an issue, over the last decade or so, and digital extension and advisory services actually helping then address some of some of those constraints related to supply chain security and quality. Then finally, in terms of just the summary of what I'm presenting, the role of the extensionist, I'm happy when I read some of the literature from GFRAS. It already indicates this, that the extensionist of 10 years ago is different from the extensionist of today, and even more so within the next 10 years. The anticipation is that in as much as the extentionists traditionally would do training, visit, have more physical interaction with the farmers, but we now foresee the extensionist being a digital facilitator, being able to direct farmers to get help to the solutions of the problems that they have within their own farm, anchoring on digitization. Because I think one of the benefits that digitization has, or two of them, is number one, there is a reach at minimal, and secondly, there is minimal cost in comparison to traditional models. So I usually want to make such presentations, grounded within examples of uh, work that is already being done, and I just want to share or draw insights from some of the work that we are doing. So the reason why we believe that digitalized extension and advisory services, and especially anchoring on artificial intelligence, is actually the future, is from the initial investments that we have made. Just from digital advisory services, we've seen a growth of income, of an average of about 30%, and productivity grow, on average to about 23%. In some instances, as I'll share examples of some solutions which we're already investing in, we have seen, productivity grow as high as 75%. Yeah, we've done a couple of RCTs to prove that. And at times a bit lower, but on average, we are seeing 23%, growth. Yeah, it means if a farmer was growing, 20 bags of maize per hectare, just by the access of digitalized, advisories, there at 1.2. 1.2, that's about like around about 5 or 6 more 50 kg bags, which is significant grain, if you grew up in a cereal cropping system environment. Then if you take a step down, just to show the power of digital beyond just conventional advisory services, where digitization has facilitated market linkages, there's been 37% growth in income and 73%, growth in productivity, indicating that income does, perceived growth in income does drive productivity higher. And when it is anchored on digital, this happens rapidly faster. Then on financial services, again, we've seen, income growth of about 18%. And then, in terms of productivity, that's stimulating productivity about 38%. And these are figures, which came from the CTA digitization for our, for African agriculture, but which actually are consistent with some of the investments that, that we have made as the foundation. So this is showing us, in terms of the quantitative benefit that can actually be unlocked, by digitization. So moving on to the next slide. I don't know why my presentations is now sticking. Okay, yeah. So in terms of some observations we've made, I think as much as we are saying digital farmer services, are the future, and products that are anchored on digital will be able to move, smallholder farmers, rural advisory services forward. There are some observations which we have made, and I think there are still some cases for investment which whereby philanthropic institutions like us can actually, make a contribution. So one of the observations which we have made is that, over the last couple of years, AgTechs have actually been, on the rise in terms of mobilizing financing. And, right up to 22, I think there's approximately about 1.5 billion, which has actually been raised by AgTech companies. And predominantly these AgTech companies, in one fashion or the other, or the other, actually, provide rural advisory services. A lot of them, it is a bundled services approach whereby the advisory service, is bundled, with financial services. It is bundled, with weather data or soil information or insurance and so forth. But when you put it into context, I think that's a lot of capital that is actually, going into the market. We've got 700, disclosed deals. 426 architects funded, which makes them a total of about 1,500, I think, all in all, the total. So some of them have ventured further in terms of providing, digital marketplaces, ag fintechs, and so forth. But this is just to show that perhaps I think this meeting is good in the sense that we begin to see, the world in a canvas in terms of where is the money actually going. So it is growing. I know there's been a bit of stagnation as a result of COVID, that especially like venture capitalists, diminished funding. But if you look on the left on the global active growth in LMICs, one of the things I want you to realize is that the greatest growth is actually in sub-Saharan Africa, whereby yield gaps are actually the biggest. So I think those are dollars going the right direction, but followed by South Asia, which is in green. That is, the next biggest destination where these resources are going. So, yeah, I think contrary to a lot of, capital flows which have been going into agriculture over the last 2 decades, for the first time, we say direct response to where the yield gaps are at the largest, which is towards sub-Saharan Africa. So this is quite encouraging. So let's maybe discuss a bit about some of the initial impacts we've seen in terms of, digitization, and I'll get into the AI piece, just shortly. So one of the examples we have is, the Amakrushi solution, in India. Amakrushi essentially is a omni-channel, service delivery model whereby farmers can access advisory services through IVR. They can access advisory through SMS text messages and also on WhatsApp, through social media channels. Yeah, and what we've seen is, for example, in Odisha, we've seen that 87% of the farmers, have been reached, which is actually like 6.5 of 7.5 million farmers reached, and 31% of women have actually, been reached. I think this is encouraging because in some of these societies within the global south, religion and culture play a big factor in terms of limiting women's access to, rural advisory services and extension. So 31%, I think, is a good starting point. By 2030, our anticipation is that this will grow to about 35%. Women and having around about 90% in terms of reach. So if we are working from a point of departure of saying, a farmer would have just maybe one or two, contact points, within India in terms of engaging an extension officer per year. Now they can actually have it on a weekly basis. And the question then becomes, okay, if you've reached them, then what? Because this is a means to an end. I think extension and advisory is not an end within itself, but it's a means. It facilitates an end goal. So I think one of the benefits has been that there've been higher incomes which have been done by an independent evaluator of about $61 per farmer. And if you've ever lived within these rural communities, that's quite significant in terms of income growth. And one of the key levers, I think this is where digitization, is a benefit in comparison to traditional extension. There's been a lot of site-specific content that, is beyond just traditional agricultural curricula. For example, on rainfall, the areas which, received, the messages about the monsoon rains and so forth, farmers were better prepared in terms of dealing with aspects to do with drainage, dealing with aspects to do with mulch, and so forth. So as a result, they showed up better compared to the farmers who hadn't, they received the digital, the digital facilitated messages. Then in terms of yield growth, we saw 8.5 to about 10% rice yield growth in farmers. There was a reduction in cost of services at scale, from about $0.37 per farmer a year to about 18 cents per farmer per year. It's 6.9 million farmers. So what we're now working on is actually building up AI into it such that the advisory can now be super farmer specific. It is no longer just generalized extension. I think the weather-based advisory was good, but we now have built on other data sets such as the soil data, pest and disease decision trees and stuff. So because of that, we are beginning to see some significant productivity and income growth. The same can be say to Kenya, and for some reason, I think there's traditionally been an undervaluing of weather and climate-based advisory information, because even in Kenya, one of the content pieces that has been consumed quite significantly is data or information related to weather, such that we've had a rapid within the space of 2 years 4.8 million growth of or users of digitalized advisory services, meaning that 62% of the farmers actually have access, to this content. Traditionally, this wouldn't have been the case. Yeah, in Ethiopia, we're a bit behind simply because of the channel. We've been working with organizations such as Digital Green, that now have, chatbots. These are now interactive platforms whereby, as opposed to having a one-way exchange, you can now have a two-way a two-way exchange in terms of agricultural advisory service. So these are some of just the initial impacts. But having said that, I think in as much as we have more evidence of reach, at a global level, impact is still low. I think we shouldn't be deceived, by isolated cases where things have worked well. I think there's a lot of collaboration, still needed in terms of having, a meaningful use. And what we can define by, by meaningful use is whereby people at least have engagement, at least at 4 critical stages, of the growing season. And I can give an example of some of these stages. If you look at, the pre-planting stage whereby farmers are selecting varieties, if farmers actually consult and engage, some digital advisory solution, that's an engagement we can count. If we're then looking at planting in terms of, for those who are familiar with agronomy, optimal plant populations relative to the outlook of the season, in terms of if you are having a lean season, then it's natural for you to have a lower plant population to ensure that the fewer plants that you put have access to more soil moisture. However, on the converse, if you have higher outlook of rainfall, like Southern Africa right now is anticipating La Nina, which means, more rainfall, whereas the northern parts of the equator are anticipating less rainfall because of La Nina. Then, the plant population has to be responsive to that. So that is another engagement point. Then when there's outbreak of pests, like fall armyworm and so forth, that is another engagement piece. So it is tracking the core decisions that the farmers make and then reflecting and saying, at what point do the farmer use or engage this? But there are post-harvest activities like the marketing, the storage itself, the semi-processing done by the farmers. So when you take all of that in terms of meaningful use, is still relatively low. You find that all farmers will at some point, where digital advisory services are availed, and it's usually for free, they will engage, with the content or with the solution. But in terms of meaningful engagement, I can say we can roughly say we're still at 27%, just looking at the global context. And when I say global, I mean, like global South, South Asia, Sub-Sahara Africa, those kind of geographies. This is the data that we are seeing so far. So, in terms of the costs, just to validate, why, all, advisors and extension players should now be looking at strongly leveraging on digitalization and AI. We see if you look at the middle graph, so it's hard to, to present without a pointer. If we're in a room, I would have been pointing at this. But if you look at the cost per, small scale producer analysis, you realize that, traditional, extension delivery methods are very high, then followed by pure digital. And this throws in another caveat that where we are right now, I don't think we are ready for a fully, digitized, extension and advisory, ecosystem. But we are seeing a hybrid delivering, the best results. And surprisingly, the costs are actually lower, because once the farmers have seen or have had some form of demonstration or some form of physical support, the confidence level of engagement with the digital tool goes higher, and they then become sort of like reference points to other farmers who didn't have the physical engagement, which means they're actually continuing the physical engagement without the presence of the former extension worker, but encouraging the other smallholder farmers to actually then sign on to the digital platform. So when you then model it out, at state level or at national level, we actually realize that at this stage, a hybrid system actually is more of in terms of low cost and in terms of impact. The hybrid is actually way much more higher than digital standing individually. So I think we can talk of extension in the next 10 years, but we should also talk about the journey within those 10 years. I think uh, physical extension, in my view, should never be, fully, removed or considered no longer as effective. But I think the utilization of digital tools in conjunction with some physical channels of some sort or intermediaries of some sort actually delivers, best case results. So I normally use this analogy that people should see digital tools as a general practitioner. If you're sick, and I think India has modeled this very well in terms of their telehealth. If you are sick, you are able to actually, get some basic advice or even a prescription, using digital interactive channels. However, when it now gets down to a specific, let's just say if there's an outbreak of lumpy skin or there's a need for the veterinary vaccinations and so forth, that is when we then see the activation of, the physical intermediary now coming to actually intervene or engage, with the smallholder farmers. But he is responding to specific hotspots of an issue which cannot be resolved just by, a digital interactive channel. So, just to build on the evidence now of growth, as I said, I like anchoring a keynote speech like this on some initial evidence, even though it's not at scale, but at least we can ground our discussion not on theory, but on the practical realities of what has been happening. So, we at the foundation, we have one of our partners called ISDA. They've developed what they call the virtual agronomist. This is essentially, a chatbot, that is integrated to WhatsApp. Now it's differing from, what we usually we had like 10 years ago when digital extension started to make its boom. We would have an application whereby we would refer farmers and the content would be static. The difference now is this is now site specific. So if you have a farm in Brazil or if you have a farm in Nigeria, the virtual agronomist advises you based on the context of where you are physically. So yeah, an example will be on plant nutrition. Instead of just giving blanket recommendations, there are digital soil maps which underline, or there's a digital soil map data set underlying, this chatbot interactive feature whereby the exact nutrients on your farm when you enter your location can be predicted. And the margin of error is, I think we were talking of a variance of 10% to say if you go to a wet chemistry laboratory and you look at the soil map data set, you see just a difference of about 10% of nutrients. Meaning to say if you apply 90% of your wet chemistry requirements basing on this solution, it means that general from a yield level, if the one harvests 5.5 tons, the other one just harvests 5 tons, which is not too much difference. So, we are confident in solutions like this being able to actually advance productivity at scale. In Uganda, where they've deployed this across 20,000 plots, yeah, not only Uganda, but actually in 5 countries. But in Uganda, we've seen an increase in yield of about 66%, which is moving farmers from 1 tons hectares of maize to about 4 tons hectares of maize, whereby you identify same agroecology. You can actually, have farmers side by side, a proper RCT, and you see the difference between the typical practices versus the practices recommended by the virtual agronomists, which are site specific. We've seen, growth as that high, 66%. So we feel that, within the next 10 years, extension and advisory services will become very much tailored to the farmer's individual context. And it will not only be tailored in terms of the field operational aspects, but also tailored to the farmer's resources. So let's say a farmer doesn't have resources to buy fertilizers. Can the solution make recommendation to the farmer to incorporate or use organic material to actually address their soil fertility issues? So it is grounding the advisory within the context of the farmer on an individual basis, case by case. So it means what will happen on farmer A might be very different to what is recommended for farmer B, just looking at the resource-based view of, of those individual farms. Then the second example I want to make is of digital green, whereby within this dashboard, we've asked ourselves the question, what really are farmers asking? I think in, one of the extension learning kits, which GFRAS, has authored or published, there's emphasis of demand-driven extension. So I think we are now moving into a world in which we now have to have very good data analytics in terms of being able to understand what farmers are actually demanding, ensuring that what they demand is actually being responded to. So it was interesting to note that, within, digital green, farm chat platform, the traditional cereals are not what actually had a lot of demand in terms of inquiries. On the left bottom graph on the left, you'll notice that pest and disease were actually one of, some of the areas which had, significant inquiries. Fertilizers was lower, varieties was lower. So it shows that farmers have a problem with pest and disease. So you can then even, engage private sector with this data to say that in terms of the product and solutions, whether they are biopesticides or, they are synthetic pesticides, you can then have a case to then say, deploy your resources or make your investment strategy or business strategy leveraging on this data. If you look to the right, the queries across crops, as I was mentioning, dairy and poultry actually had high inquiries, 28% just for dairy. But then you then ask yourself, for traditional cereals like maize, it's less than, 0.4%. So instead of us bombarding farmers with a lot of content in terms of maize, perhaps maybe we now need to re-ask ourselves, what are the crops which farmers are actually caring about the most, and where do they need information more? Because I think one of the some of the underestimations we've done about smallholder farmers is in terms of some of the traditional crops they've grown, we continuously assume that they don't know sufficiently about that crop, or they still want to consume more content about that. At times, the limitation is actually inputs, not the knowledge. But for some of these nuanced value chains, content actually is the problem, not the inputs. So, an example, yeah, being poultry as well, within the South Asia example. So, this showcases that the future is more interactive, more demand driven. But the good thing now is because of digital dashboards, we can actually be able to identify where stronger responses are needed from the extensionist perspective. So going now onto the onto the AI piece, without complicating the conversation, I'm cognizant of time, but maybe if I can go up for an additional 5 minutes or so. We realize that there are big data sets which are actually needed to actually be able to drive an AI-backed system, and there's a strong need for collaboration on data, collaboration on delivery. So one of the investment strategies which we have employed within the foundation is to build significant corpuses of data. GFRAS will have its data through its networks in terms of, farmer interactions, content, yield performance analysis based on, crop asset, crop and livestock assessments. The CG from its research trials will have its own big corpuses of data. The private sector. So we need to get to a point whereby we now build these corpuses of data, or conglomerate in terms of building corpuses of data, such that some of these large language models can actually be able to generate content that is useful, relevant, and does not hallucinate in terms of delivering content, to the smallholder farmers. At the same time, when you look at the right, we need some form of prioritization in terms of use cases. What is the starting point? How do we validate? How do we benchmark use cases in terms of identifying opportunities for skills? Then, in terms of on the models piece, there's a need for optimization of data and methods through models. Yeah, I think on the models part, some people are believing that actually we might need agricultural specific models that we actually, we just dump our data within the models and they actually respond to, agricultural, development needs. Some people are saying, okay, let's fine tune the existing, models, like Llama, and all these other, AI models. They're quite a lot. But at the end of the day, I think there is a need for AI ready data, and there is need some form of, protocol definition, standards definition to make it as the abundance of data and content that is out there to be actually AI ready. So what I'm just trying to say by this slide is there is a big collaboration, piece required looking forward, and we can't continue with business as usual. So maybe just to summarize with a bit more examples in terms of some of the work we are doing, and whereby we'll be willing, to collaborate and share insights and learnings and actually get feedback is, just showing in terms of maybe four examples of consortiums that were funded that we're trying to bring the ecosystem together. So, for example, in BR, we're working on the rice, wheat, and maize value chains with channels like, a chatbot, Android based apps, IVR, SMS. We've tried to, involve retrieval or augmented generation, of data. The languages we're focusing on are English and Hindi. And what's encouraging right now is, we were first told that, for speech recognition, language translation, you needed 1,000 hours of data. It's actually coming down to about 400 right now. So it means very soon we'll be very able to actually be able to deliver, localized, voice interactive solutions to smallholder farmers, which are actually in the language they understand. I think, we do have, our social media channels, like Telegram, WhatsApp, which we are delivering in BIA in Kenya. We are also having voice hotlines, IVR systems, yeah, in BIA in Kenya as well. So I think essentially what I'm just trying to emphasize here is there's a rapid proliferation of these models now being able to actually customize to local languages, such that We now have interactive extension, but which is built in a language that, the smallholder farmer can understand. So Carl had given me 20 minutes. I think I've gone now for 24 minutes. Maybe let me stop here, but I'm happy to share, some of the other additional, activities that we're doing vis-a-vis our outlook in terms of what the future agriculture looks like. So I'll stop here for now. Forgive me, I didn't speak about the business models as much as I wanted or the role of the new extensionist, but at least I think I gave a high-level summary. So having said that, I will stop here and be open to have a bit of conversation in terms of what I've just presented. So thank you so much. I hope you found this useful.
Thank you, Tawanda. You covered a lot of territory there. It's useful, very interesting to hear the experience and the thinking, the ideas that you're working with.